Arrival and unease. Ethan McCall rose before dawn, the chill of the early morning pressing against his weathered skin. The ranch lay quiet, only the low murmur of cattle and the distant whistle of a wind through the prairie grasses breaking the stillness. Since Anna's death 2 years ago, the sprawling fields had felt emptier, the walls of the modest farmhouse echoing with absence. He moved mechanically through his morning chores, brushing his hands against rough wood, counting fence posts, stacking hay bales, the rhythm of work a faint salve to grief that refused to soften. The letters had arrived weeks ago. A match, carefully arranged, a mail-order bride selected for him from across the country. Ethan had imagined a woman refined and talkative, someone to fill the silence of his home, and perhaps coax a few smiles from the remnants of his wounded heart. Each day, as he stared down the long dirt road that led into town, he pictured the life that might come. Shared breakfasts, soft conversation by the hearth, the companionship of a woman who could understand him without effort. The sun had barely begun its ascent when a wagon rattled along the gravel path, horses straining against their harnesses. Ethan's heart, unused to anticipation, quickened. He stood on the porch, squinting against the growing light. The wagon slowed, and there, beside a small trunk and a bundle of belongings, stood the young woman he had been expecting. She was nothing like he had pictured. Clara Hawthorne was slight, almost fragile, her dark eyes wide and wary, lips pressed in a line that refused speech. She did not speak. She did not smile. She moved with careful, deliberate motions, as though the air itself might betray her. Ethan's first instinct was confusion. He studied her, searching for the spark of familiarity that might ease his unease, but it remained elusive. "Miss Hawthorne," he said, voice low, testing the name. No answer came, only a tilt of her head, a faint nod, acknowledging him without words. She handed him a neatly folded note, her fingers trembling slightly. Ethan unfolded it. A simple introduction, a few lines expressing gratitude for the opportunity, yet no hint of the personality he had imagined. The ranch hands lingered nearby, eyes flicking between Ethan and the silent girl. Whispers floated in the crisp morning air, speculation about the unusual arrival, hushed questions about her youth, her quietude. Ethan felt a prickle of protectiveness and a creeping discomfort. The girl was vulnerable, yes, but her silence suggested secrets, a depth he could not immediately reach. He led her toward the farmhouse, watching her movements with wary attention. She followed without complaint, carrying only what she could manage, her gaze flickering to the sprawling fields as though measuring their expanse. There was an intensity in her observation, an alertness that contradicted her fragile appearance. Ethan felt both drawn to her and unsettled by the unspoken tension that hung between them. Inside the kitchen, he prepared a simple breakfast, each motion deliberate, almost ritualistic. Clara watched quietly, her dark hair falling in loose waves, hands clasped in front of her. When he set the plate on the table, she did not move immediately, hesitating as if testing the boundaries of this new world. Finally, she sat, nodding in acknowledgement, and picked up the fork with careful precision. Her silence weighed on him more heavily than any conversation could have. As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the floorboards, Ethan led her on a tour of the ranch. The barn, the corrals, the modest stables, each corner filled with memories of labor and loss. Clara followed, absorbing every detail, her eyes lingering on the horses, the grain sacks, the tools he used daily. When they reached the pasture, she stepped forward, hands brushing against the tall grass, and for the first time, he glimpsed a flicker of curiosity behind her guarded expression. That evening, as the sky bled shades of orange and purple, Ethan sat on the porch, sipping coffee and watching her wander to the edge of the fields. Her small silhouette against the vast horizon emphasized the gulf of silence between them. Yet in that quiet, he sensed a story waiting to be told, a bond that might yet be forged. He could not deny a rising sense of unease. Her youth, her silence, the hidden depth in her eyes, but neither could he resist a flicker of hope. Perhaps she would grow into the companion he longed for. Perhaps, in time, the walls of grief could crumble just enough to make room for something new. The wind stirred, rustling the prairie grass, and Ethan knew the night would bring only questions. Yet he could not turn away from the horizon, where she moved like a shadow on the edge of his world. Whatever lay ahead, the story had begun, and neither silence nor distance could undo it. Bonds and shadows. The morning sun filtered through the slats of the barn, casting long stripes across the hay-strewn floor. Ethan McCall moved with practiced ease, opening stalls, checking feed, and inspecting the horse's hooves. Clara followed behind, tentative but determined, her small hands brushing against rough wooden beams as she walked. Each motion was careful, deliberate, and Ethan couldn't help but notice the way she observed everything. The subtle flex of a horse's muscles, the pattern of dust motes in the sun, the curl of smoke rising from the chimney. "You needn't rush," Ethan said, his voice low but steady, as he handed her a halter. She only nodded, meeting his eyes briefly before turning to the horse with a shy curiosity. Though she had yet to speak a word, her attentiveness spoke volumes. He found himself studying her, trying to decipher the thoughts behind those dark, observant eyes. As the day progressed, he assigned her simple chores, carrying grain, stacking hay, and brushing the horses. She struggled at first, fumbling with the weight of the sacks and the stubborn horses, but Ethan's patience was unwavering. With each small success, a subtle bond began to form, built not on words, but on shared labor and mutual respect. Her silence became less a barrier and more a language of its own, a series of gestures, glances, and quiet determination that Ethan found increasingly compelling. By midday, the distant sound of a wagon rattling along the dirt road interrupted their routine. Ethan glanced up, eyebrows narrowing slightly. Jacob Reyes, a neighboring rancher, had arrived unexpectedly. Tall, confident, and effortlessly charming, Jacob had a reputation for flirtation and an easy smile that had earned him attention wherever he went. Today, however, his gaze lingered longer than necessary on Clara. Jacob tipped his hat, voice smooth. "Morning, Ethan. Thought I'd bring some supplies, and maybe say hello to the new arrival." His eyes sparkled with a mischievous curiosity as he glanced at Clara, who froze slightly, her hands tightening on the halter. Ethan's jaw tightened. Something protective stirred deep within him, a low hum of unease that mingled with something unfamiliar, jealousy. He forced a polite nod. "She's learning the ropes. I'd appreciate it if you gave her some space." Jacob's smile widened, faintly teasing, but he nodded. Still, Ethan couldn't shake the way Jacob's attention seemed to linger on Clara longer than appropriate. The sight ignited an unexpected flicker of possessiveness in him, a reminder that even grief could not shield him from desire. Clara, sensing the tension, remained silent, her gaze flicking between the two men, unsure of the invisible rules she had yet to understand. She moved with the same careful precision she had shown since arriving, her body language reflecting a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Ethan noticed every subtle twitch, every hesitant step, and felt a stirring protectiveness he could not fully explain. As the afternoon waned, Ethan suggested they check the fences along the northern pasture. Walking side by side, he pointed out the weak posts, the sagging wire, guiding her hands to steady the tools. There was a rhythm to their labor, a wordless conversation of glances and gestures, hands brushing against one another as they worked in tandem. Each shared moment deepened the fragile trust that had begun to form between them. Yet, beneath the growing connection lay a subtle tension, a shadow cast by Jacob's presence and the unspoken curiosity in Clara's eyes. Ethan sensed it, the pull of attraction that lingered just out of reach, and wondered how much of her attention was truly his. His late wife's memory hovered at the edges of his mind, a reminder that the heart's desires could never be trusted fully, and yet he could not resist the slow warming that came with each silent acknowledgement, each fleeting smile that never reached her lips. By dusk, they returned to the farmhouse, muscles tired, hands smeared with dust, yet hearts strangely lightened. Clara paused at the edge of the porch, looking out across the rolling fields, the sky painted with shades of gold and lavender. For the first time, she hesitated without fear, as though considering something beyond the immediate task at hand. Ethan watched her silhouette, feeling the pull of both hope and unease, wondering what thoughts hid behind her quiet eyes. That evening, as he prepared supper, Ethan's mind wandered back to Jacob's lingering gaze, to Clara's hesitant glances, to the tension that neither of them yet acknowledged. He sensed that the bond forming between them, though fragile and silent, was already being tested by forces he could neither control nor fully anticipate. The wind stirred outside, carrying with it the scent of distant pine and the faint promise of rain. Clara sat at the edge of the porch, hands clasped in her lap, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Ethan knew the questions would only grow with time. Questions of trust, desire, and loyalty. Yet, beneath the tension, there was a quiet promise, something unspoken that drew him closer, even as the shadows lengthened. The day ended not with answers, but with anticipation. And in that quiet space, Ethan realized that the story of this summer, the story of Clara, of himself, and of the invisible temptations pressing against them, was only just beginning. Secrets in the shadows. The evening air hung heavy with the scent of damp earth, the prairie grass glistening under the first drops of rain. Ethan had retired to the porch after a long day, hands calloused and aching, his mind drifting toward Clara and the silent energy she carried with her. Since her arrival, he had grown accustomed to her quiet presence, yet there were moments when her gaze seemed elsewhere, distant and filled with thoughts he could not reach. Clara, meanwhile, had taken to exploring the edges of the ranch once her chores were complete. The northern pasture called to her, the expanse of rolling fields and whispering winds offering freedom she rarely felt elsewhere. Her movements were light, deliberate, as though she was testing the boundaries of this new life. She carried with her a small notebook, sketches of the ranch, the horses, the distant hills, a world she could understand even when words failed her. It was during one of these solitary walks that Jacob Reyes appeared, stepping quietly from the shadows where the wind had carried him. "Evening, Clara," he said, his tone easy, disarmingly warm. She startled, clutching the notebook to her chest, but did not flee. Instead, she studied him, silent and wary. Jacob's smile softened the tension, and for a moment, her rigid posture loosened. Ethan, unaware of the encounter, checked the fences near the barn, muttering to himself about loose wires. A sharp sense of unease had been gnawing at him all day, a premonition he couldn't shake. He chalked it up to fatigue, but something deeper pressed at the edges of his awareness, an instinct honed over years of solitude and loss. Jacob and Clara walked along the edge of the pasture, their conversation replaced by gestures and shared glances. He pointed to a fence post that needed mending, and she nodded, her fingers tracing the grain of the wood as she understood his unspoken instructions. There was a closeness forming, subtle and unacknowledged, that Ethan would have immediately recognized had he been watching. Back at the barn, Ethan noticed a misplaced tool, a hoof pick not returned to its proper spot. A small, nagging tension rose in his chest. His steps quickened toward the northern pasture, heart thudding as the wind carried faint voices. From a distance, he saw them, Jacob and Clara, close together, hands nearly touching, heads bent toward one another in an intimacy that words would have only confirmed. Ethan's chest tightened, a surge of protective anger mingled with fear he could not name. His late wife's memory whispered in the back of his mind, a cautionary echo. Grief could not shield the heart from desire, nor could silence protect it from betrayal. He lingered in the shadows, unseen, watching the subtle gestures that spoke of mutual curiosity, of temptation flirting at the edges of loyalty. Clara, for her part, felt the pull of something she could not yet define. Ethan's kindness, his patience, his steady presence anchored her, yet Jacob's energy stirred a longing for attention, for the thrill of being noticed in ways Ethan's quiet watchfulness could not provide. Her notebook trembled in her hands as she sketched the contours of the land, her eyes flicking to Jacob, the unspoken tension pulling her in conflicting directions. A sudden gust of wind swept across the prairie, scattering loose pages from her notebook. Jacob bent to retrieve them, brushing a lock of hair from her face. She flinched, startled, yet the gesture lingered in memory, a sensation both dangerous and intoxicating. At that moment, Ethan's shadowed figure loomed closer, a silent witness to the fleeting connection that neither of them could fully name. The three returned to the ranch house as night fell, though the air between them remained taut with unspoken questions. Clara moved quietly, eyes downcast, aware of Ethan's gaze yet unsure how much he had seen. Jacob lingered near the stables, offering a polite nod before retreating, leaving the night to stretch endlessly between them. Inside the farmhouse, Ethan poured a drink and stared at the fire, mind restless. The day's events replayed in fragments. The slight brush of fingers, the tilt of Clara's head, Jacob's easy smile. He could not deny the unease that settled deep in his chest, nor the growing awareness that Clara's silence, once comforting in its mystery, now masked a complexity he was unprepared to confront. Clara, in her room, traced the outline of a horse in her notebook, thoughts scattered and turbulent. She had entered this new life with cautious hope, yet the encounter with Jacob awakened a curiosity she had not anticipated. The quiet of the ranch, the routine of chores, the presence of Ethan, all of it suddenly felt less certain, as if the world itself had tilted slightly, leaving her to navigate desires she could neither name nor fully resist. As the night deepened, the wind whispered through the cracks of the farmhouse, carrying the scent of rain and distant pine. Ethan and Clara lay awake, separated by walls and unspoken tension, each aware that the balance of trust and temptation was fragile. Outside, the stars blinked silently, indifferent witnesses to the unfolding drama, and the story of this summer continued, teetering on the edge of revelation and betrayal. Storm and choice. Rain fell in thick sheets, drumming against the tin roof of the farmhouse and drenching the prairie beyond. Ethan McCall stood at the edge of the porch, coat clinging to his shoulders, gaze fixed on the fields where the wind bent the tall grass into a wild dance. Tonight, the tension he had sensed for days could no longer be ignored. Clara's silence, once comforting, had become a labyrinth of uncertainty, and Jacob's subtle presence lingered like a shadow he could not banish. Clara emerged from the farmhouse doorway, cloak drawn tight, hair plastered to her forehead. Her notebook was clutched to her chest, pages damp, sketches smudged from the rain. She hesitated, glancing at Ethan, then down at her feet, uncertainty etched in every line of her small frame. The air between them was taut, charged with emotion neither dared to name. Ethan stepped forward, boots sinking slightly into the muddy ground. "Clara," he began, voice firm yet restrained, "we need to talk." There was no anger in his tone, only the weight of a man who had loved and lost, and who now faced the fragile trust of someone new. She nodded, eyes wide, and lifted her gaze briefly to meet his. The words she did not speak were heavy, but in the tilt of her head and the tightening of her hands around the notebook, Ethan felt the turmoil within her. He realized that her silence had never been simple obedience. It had been a barrier, a shield against a world that demanded more than she was ready to give. The wind gusted, carrying with it a faint sound from the northern pasture, the creak of a wagon and the soft shuffle of boots. Jacob Reyes appeared through the rain, coat slick with water, his expression unreadable. "Evening, Ethan," he called, voice steady despite the storm. "I thought I'd check on Clara before the night worsened." Ethan's jaw tightened. He took a deliberate step forward, eyes locked on Jacob. "She doesn't need anyone else's attention tonight," he said, voice low but controlled. Every instinct screamed at him: protectiveness, desire, fear of betrayal. But he held himself firm, unwilling to act without clarity. Clara's eyes flicked between the two men, heart pounding. She had been drawn to Jacob's charm, intrigued by the attention. Yet in Ethan's steady gaze, she recognized a depth she could not deny. Her hand hovered over the pages of her notebook, torn between two worlds. The allure of something new and the quiet strength of the man who had welcomed her into his life without expectation. A sharp crack of thunder split the sky, forcing a moment of pause. Jacob raised his hands slightly, an unspoken truce, yet his presence remained an undeniable temptation. Ethan's gaze softened as he approached Clara, gently resting a hand near hers, not touching, merely guiding, offering reassurance without pressure. Finally, Clara spoke, not a full sentence, but a word, fragile and trembling. Stay. The simplicity of the request carried more weight than any elaborate explanation. In that instant, the storm outside mirrored the storm within her heart, chaotic yet clarifying. Jacob's expression shifted, understanding without bitterness. He nodded once, sharply, then stepped back into the darkness of the storm, leaving the two of them alone. The tension dissipated slightly, leaving a quiet stillness that was both relief and reckoning. Ethan gathered her notebook, smoothing damp pages with careful fingers. "You don't have to speak to prove anything," he said softly. "I'll understand what you mean, even if it's just in gestures." Clara's hand hovered over his, brushing briefly against his coat. A small, unspoken acknowledgement of trust and connection. The rain lessened to a drizzle, and the prairie beyond the porch shimmered in the muted light of a hidden moon. Clara and Ethan moved toward the farmhouse together, steps cautious, yet in sync, as if the long hours of labor, silence, and mutual observation had led them naturally to this point. Every glance, every slight movement, communicated understanding, commitment, and the fragile beginnings of love tempered by trials. That night, as the wind softened and the storm receded, the farmhouse held a quiet warmth. Clara settled near the fire, sketching the ranch in its damp glory, while Ethan watched, aware of her growth, her courage, and the silent dialogue that now existed between them. Outside, the world remained unpredictable, full of temptation and uncertainty, yet within the walls of the ranch, trust had been restored, fragile but real. Ethan knew the days ahead would test them again. Curiosity, outside influences, and the lingering shadows of desire. But for tonight, the tension had resolved. He had chosen patience and understanding over anger. She had chosen loyalty and honesty over fleeting temptation. And in that shared, wordless accord, both recognized that love could take root even in silence, even after grief, even after trials that threatened to pull them apart. The stars emerged slowly through parting clouds, indifferent witnesses to the choices made below. Ethan and Clara, bound by trust and quiet understanding, moved forward together, two hearts finding rhythm in the silent spaces, and a story only just beginning beyond the storm.